If you've played a major AAA title in the last decade, odds are you've been disappointed. There have been issues with games since there have been games, and new titles being released unfinished is certainly far from a universal problem, but it feels like it's become more and more prevalent in recent years. Video games are an art form that offers both unique challenges and unique opportunities. They tell an interactive story which gives players varying levels of control over the outcome depending on the game. Player choice must be taken into account even in linear games because everyone's thought process works differently. How is it that seemingly so many games have been released in clearly unfinished and in some cases borderline unplayable states? Better yet, how have developers been able to turn things around post-launch? Short answer to the first question, because we buy them. As for the second, let's take a look at this development practice across multiple different games and see what patterns we can find. Full disclosure, I started writing this immediately after the Starfield 2.0 but not really update was announced. I did a review of that game quite a while ago where I highlighted some of the positive changes that had been made in its first year. Of course, that was also pre-Shattered Space, a DLC I never finished and a game I've barely touched since making that video. At the time of writing, I am definitely hopeful for the new update and the Terran Armada DLC, but stick around for my thoughts on that once I actually get to play it. Deadlines have been around at least as long as capitalism itself, and game developers are often forced to deal with some of the most unreasonable ones. But sometimes you have games that have been baking for upwards of a decade and still come out some combination of ugly, glitchy, or just plain empty. 20 years ago, players were stuck with whatever shape the final build of a game took. This actually led to some interesting situations where games had some tweaks made between production runs, leading to different versions being available for sale. Today, however, things are much different. Most big games these days are released with day one patches, developers tossing in fixes and squashing a few bugs they didn't have a chance to get to before their deadline. Seems innocent enough, if a bit annoying as a player that now has to wait an extra hour to jump into the game I just got. This is how the gaming landscape has changed. Games are, by and large, no longer seen as products to ship, but as services to engage. And this isn't just a video game problem either. Basically every software out there today isn't sold outright, but is available for users to subscribe to use. I get it, it's guaranteed revenue, blah blah blah. Another long argument could be made here about the shift towards not actually owning anything anymore, but rather renting everything piecemeal. That'll be a topic for another video though. When the 7th console generation introduced the ability for players to connect to the internet, a shift began. Developers were no longer confined to only what they could squeeze into their initial development cycle before games shipped. They could now introduce patches to improve games on the fly, and even add things to their games that had not been included on the original disc. DLC is something that will be touched on briefly here as well, but is also core to the beginnings of the live service strategy. Again, topic for another video. Games began trying new things, introducing fresh ideas and exploring alternative models. Development cycles for big games began to be planned around the release of usually multiple DLC packs. Call of Duty specifically was huge in this. Back when Activision was working Treyarch and Infinity Ward to the bone to get games out every year, you could reliably count on 4 DLC packs during a game's lifecycle. Shifting focus, even if by a relatively little bit, also requires shifting resources. Time and people were diverted from working on the initial release build of many games because studios began creating DLC before games had even shipped. As you can probably imagine, this led to less polished releases. Bugs became more common and content that couldn't be touched in time had to be cut. Now, I do want to clarify that this change in focus is not the only thing that contributed to this problem. Games also became immensely more complex over the years, with more moving parts and dependencies than ever, but this shift certainly contributed. No longer was there a worry that development had to be completely finished by launch. Players in this time period were used to pre-ordering games, a practice that was almost essential to guarantee that there would be enough physical stock to serve everyone. It made sense. Mostly. Put down at least a minimum hold fee on a copy of a new game that interests you and make sure you get to pick it up on release day. Or midnight launch for some titles. But those don't really exist anymore, and pre-orders are significantly less popular than they used to be. Why pay for a game ahead of time when quality is not so assured as it was back then? Better to wait for a patch or two, just to make sure things are as smooth as they can be. With games continuing to get bigger and more graphically complex, and as their business models have shifted more into the live service mindset, this problem has compounded. Bigger maps are often made with lower density. There are many reasons for this, not least of which is usually hardware limitations. But it's not just lower density. Lots of games in the 8th and 9th console generations, i.e. about the last 10 to 15 years, have had persistent visual bugs or just shoddy animation. Quest-breaking or even game-breaking glitches are not uncommon. Even titles devoid of microtransactions or Battle Pass purgatory have been released in such a state. The solution that many big studios have embraced for this problem fits right in line with a live service model. Quality assurance used to be a step in the process. Studios had teams dedicated to it and would bring in playtesters to experience and hopefully break their games so they could learn how to fix them. All of this was to be done before the games were boxed up and shipped. These days, open betas and AI simulation are much more common. With the former option, games are deliberately released in an unfinished state while development is still ongoing to gather live feedback from players. In the latter, AI models are used to simulate thousands of hours of gameplay and log any bugs encountered. While I don't particularly have a problem with the idea of having an open beta, relying solely on unpaid everyday gamers is entirely a money-based decision, as is relying on AI. And we all know how reliable the robots are with information. My point here is that QA is no longer a step in the process and something to be signed off on before release. Just like how content is mandated to continually evolve under the live service model, development is not intended to end at launch. Studios no longer see a need to go through the trouble of a fine polish before getting a game into players' hands, because the data shows they'll buy it anyway. So we find ourselves caught up in this phenomenon of unfinished games getting fine-tuned over their life cycle until they are finally regarded as being in the state they should have been upon release. But that doesn't mean people won't demand refunds in the meantime.
Wake the fuck up, samurai.
We kinda have to start here, don't we? Cyberpunk 2077 is probably the biggest, or at least most well-known example of this phenomenon in recent memory. There's no denying that CD Projekt Red had ambitious plans for this game. They shifted their primary focus to Cyberpunk following their massive success with The Witcher 3 in 2015, but work actually began a few years earlier in 2012. For those keeping track, this means the game spent nearly a decade under development by the time it was released in 2020. Hype built throughout the entire development cycle, with Cyberpunk even winning a bunch of awards pre-release. Upon release, well, messy would be an understatement. The PC and, at the time, next-gen console versions fared fairly well, but still suffered from some bugginess and visual issues. Previous console generations were significantly less lucky. Night City and the PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game looked much emptier with far less detail. Even worse, the game could barely run. It's likely that CDPR had some idea this was going to be the case as well, given that every review copy of the game they sent out prior to launch was the PC version. All of this led to one of the most disastrous launches in gaming history, and prompted specific exceptions to long-held return and refund policies. Sony actually delisted Cyberpunk 2077 from the PlayStation Store for a time, and both Sony and Microsoft placed warnings on the game's listing regarding performance issues. In the US, GameStop even accepted returns of open copies of the game, which was pretty much unheard of before this incident. There were even multiple class action lawsuits and investigations launched in different regions. Despite all of these very real problems, Cyberpunk remains fairly highly regarded today. It was able to win many players back with a commitment to fixing things, as well as the release of a tie-in animated show and one of the greatest story expansions in gaming history. But even with the issues, many players stuck with the game. The story remained interesting and engaging, with great performances from the voice acting talent. Night City was vibrant and beautiful and fun to explore, at least when everything ran smoothly enough to do so. Cyberpunk was, flaws and all, built on a solid foundation of writing and enough good ideas to show it had real potential. Then patches started rolling in. They were numerous and large, improving the game's visuals and stability greatly. Edgerunners renewed interest in 2022 as well, and coincided with a few little additions to V's inventory. As time passed, Cyberpunk's reputation, and CDPR's by extension, began to be repaired. Patient players were rewarded with a much more pleasant experience, and many who had sought refunds initially began to return. Finally, in 2023, CDPR released the 2.0 update. This massive overhaul rebalanced and/or changed just about every mechanic in the game, and the player base seems to mostly agree these changes were positive. It was also immediately followed by the release of Phantom Liberty, which stands as one of the best story expansions ever. These fixes, changes, and additions transformed Cyberpunk into what many have said is the state it should have been released in. Two key factors were consistent across this journey. For one, CDPR took a step back from developing new projects and invested the time and resources to bring their game up to par. They also had a strong foundation to build on. Cyberpunk 2077 had generated a lot of interest over its near decade of development, and the story and setting lived up to what was promised even if the full experience decidedly didn't. But that was all the more reason to make it right. This is a game that had its reputation repaired despite the rightfully eroded trust its release build earned. Ah, the wonderful world of Pokémon. Peacefully free of glitches, not now missing no, and tons of fun to explore. While the formula of the mainline games has become a bit repetitive over the years, it's still an iconic experience with a lot of possibility. Even before the Switch era, Game Freak tried experimenting with novel ideas in both storytelling and mechanics. New regions were bigger, and exploration began shifting more towards a true open world with each subsequent release. Alola tried something different in place of the customary gym challenge and introduced the Ultra Beasts, and every generation from Gen 6 onwards had some kind of battle gimmick. Regional variants of well-known Pokémon even began popping up. These experiments were more or less standalone endeavors. Each new release, with the exception of Ultra Sun and Moon, pretty much tried a new formula variant to see what stuck. The one thing that was pretty consistent was the bigger emphasis on exploration through each generation. Players began being given more options, and gained access to more wide open spaces starting with wild areas in Galar. While this idea is still being developed, it has been leaned into especially heavily in recent years. Pokémon Legends Arceus took players to the ancient Hisui region, where they were presented with a much more action RPG-focused experience. Exploration was key, and interacting with Pokémon was much more fluid. The following mainline release, Scarlet and Violet, took cues from this and did things very similarly. Paldea was a much less linear region, both in terrain design and story. It introduced a fresh art style and a new battle gimmick in the form of terrestrialization, and took regional variants of Pokémon a step further with fully diverging evolutionary lines and paradox Pokémon. Unfortunately for players, this bold vision was less than stable. Visual bugs were plentiful and the game's performance was widely criticized. Shortly following release, many players requested refunds. Fortunately, Game Freak released multiple patches in the months following the game's launch and even into 2024. Much of the graphical and performance issues were solved with these initial updates, which allowed them to focus on the Teal Mask and Indigo Disc DLCs. These expansions did not match up with Phantom Liberty in scope or story impact, which I think is fair to say despite the genre difference given that they were released around the exact same time. They did add back in over 200 Pokemon that had been introduced in previous generations, but this begs the question, why was that necessary? There were positive changes that resulted from this rocky launch. Like CDPR with Cyberpunk, Game Freak did take a step back to fix their game and reassess their plans moving forward. Takato Utsunomiya, COO of the Pokémon Company, even made a statement saying that they would be discussing the series' release schedule moving forward. Whatever decision they arrived at, it shows. Legends EA was released in October 2025 with a further expansion of the open world exploration and battle mechanics, and it has been met with pretty wide acclaim. Generation 10 was also announced recently, and while very little is currently known about Pokémon Winds and Waves, it appears that this new region will be bigger and more beautiful. Scarlet and Violet may not have had the huge turnaround that other games have seen, but they did inspire better decisions moving forward.
Almost heaven.
Yeah, not quite. Bethesda's minimally multiplayer online role-playing game faced uncertainty throughout its development. Though it was released in 2018, work on Fallout 76 began back in 2013. Concepts from Fallout 4's development cycle, as well as the creation engine, were given to Battlecry Studios to transform into a multiplayer Fallout title that would hold fans over until Bethesda's next release. While on paper, 76 was a title developed by Bethesda Game Studios, Battlecry did most of the technical work. Bethesda largely focused on the game's story and world building. Developers at both Bethesda and Battlecry, as well as quality testers who worked on the game, cited a gross lack of cohesive leadership and immense pressure. These two things are not generally compatible. One might assume that our Lord Todd above would have been in charge of the game, but he was technically heading up work on Starfield. He did, however, have time, according to developers at Battlecry, to shoot down any new ideas they proposed. The game world itself was mostly empty at launch. Bethesda made the baffling decision to design this new larger map with 0 NPCs for players to interact with, and they stuck by this decision for some time after launch despite critiques. While this was technically explained in the main story, many players felt the explanation was inadequate. Combine that with the player limit per server set at 24 for stability reasons, and the environment felt entirely barren. What story there was in the launch version of Fallout 76 was told entirely impersonally through recorded and written logs, and it all fittingly ended with the launching of more nukes. Gameplay was also subpar from a technical perspective. There was an open beta for the game, stylized as the Break It Early test application, but the full release version still suffered from widespread bugs and stability issues. Fallout 76 was greenlit primarily to provide a new line of continual revenue for Bethesda following the financial success of Fallout Shelter. This idea took shape with multiple live service ideas, including microtransactions for cosmetics and other items, as well as a membership subscription called Fallout First. While most of the items in 76's Atomic Shop were only cosmetic at the beginning, other items were introduced later that were more pay-to-win. Players and critics alike argued that the pricing of these items was not proportional, and bemoaned the fact that items could not be earned through gameplay at any reasonable rate. Over time, through multiple updates and free expansions, many of these issues began to be addressed. In 2020, Bethesda released the Wastelanders expansion, which finally brought human NPCs back to Appalachia, and added many more quests to the game. This began a steady stream of expansions, adding in new characters and areas to explore. Technical issues were addressed bit by bit through patches, and players began to return to the now more stable game for the new content. While many improvements were made to Fallout 76 in both the story and technical side of things, it still remains a live service game intended for a certain purpose. Todd Howard was quoted in 2019 saying, quote, "It's not how you launch, it's what it becomes. It's really turned around. It's a fabulous game with an incredible community." I do agree that the journey is more important than the end or the start, but this journey fundamentally changed the product that was originally released. They had to build a new foundation for the game to sit on, and even today, 76 is not one of the more popular Fallout titles. For a concept that made it to production not to advance the art form, but to advance the studio's finances, it's exactly what you should expect. Your universe awaits. And if you just got into the game today, that statement's pretty accurate. If you experienced No Man's Sky at launch, however, it was a very different story. This was a very ambitious title which made a lot of lofty promises to players. Despite being a fairly small studio, Hello Games drew a lot of attention over the 3-year development cycle for No Man's Sky. Hype surrounding the upcoming release got a bit out of control, prompting a period of radio silence from the studio which frustrated the already large fanbase. No Man's Sky was conceptualized as an extremely open-world survival and builder game. Players would be able to explore procedurally generated planets with over 15 quintillion possibilities and make new discoveries. This was originally intended to be a multiplayer experience, with players basically being able to pop in and out of each other's instances across the universe. Of course, this could take the form of players working together to explore and survive, but it also meant that whenever something new was encountered for the first time, the player who discovered it would have the opportunity to name it. Unfortunately, these features were not present at launch. Exploration was also a hot topic before and after the game's release. If all went well, No Man's Sky was set to deliver one of the most expansive digital worlds gamers had ever seen. And technically it did. But there is a common problem encountered with procedural generation: repetition. The game engine is simply incapable of creating new assets on the fly, and so must rely on a pre-made toolkit, if you will, to generate its worlds. While it was and is a technical marvel, there are a finite number of combinations it can come up with. This resulted in many critics and players describing the gameplay as monotonous, especially when viewed alongside the more tedious survival elements. Updates for No Man's Sky have been plentiful over the years. New features, assets, and gameplay modes were added, which brought the experience closer and closer to what had been originally envisioned. This is a much different case from the games we discussed before. It was still arguably unfinished, but not because it suffered from widespread bugs or wasn't stable. It just couldn't live up to the hype. Marketing can be such a tricky thing, especially for a fairly small independent studio. Because of the hype that began building and being spread online before their game was even released, Hello Games lost control of the situation. Players were expecting everything they ever dreamed to be possible on day one, and being realistic, I don't think that was ever going to be possible. This was always going to be the type of project that evolved and got more complex over time, but big promises and unrealistic perceptions led to huge disappointment. Making the decision to go silent in the months before launch, while understandable when viewed against the goal of getting the game out on time, only made things more confusing and infuriating for those players who had their expectations set way too high. The good news today is that No Man's Sky does live up to the hype. Many have made the argument that it should have spent more time in development so that more of the initially promised features could be present in the release version, and I can't say I disagree entirely. But there is something to be said for perseverance and dedication. Communication might not have been the greatest throughout the process, but this was arguably a fledgling studio taking on a monumental task. They have spent a lot of time building, refining, and expanding the game so that it now matches the original vision. In some ways, it arguably exceeds it. This example, while still understandably frustrating at the beginning, is proof of what can be possible with a bit of cooperation and understanding.
War, disease, famine, all the classics.
For a universe 25 years in the making, it's pretty fucking empty. No, wait. I stand by what I said in my original review of Starfield. It's not a bad game, and it has some interesting ideas. If you take it for what it is, it can even be fun. But it's also the type of thing only a Bethesda fan would like, and even that seems to be significantly less true than in previous titles. The entire gaming world by now knows how quirky the creation engine is and the interesting design philosophy behind Bethesda's titles. At launch, Starfield was your everyday run-of-the-mill Bethesda title. Random protagonist encounters a great power, takes a nap, and learns that they are the only capable person in the universe.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Those things don't always happen in that order, but you get the point. It had bugs as expected, though fewer than some of their other games. There was a vast galaxy to explore with over 1,000 worlds to land on, and no one wanted to explore. Part of this is due to the same monotony of procedural generation that we talked about with No Man's Sky, but even then this game had less in it. Fewer weapons, less variety, and areas of interest you can count on your hands. In creating something so expansive, Bethesda had sacrificed the handmade worlds they were known for, and we didn't even get a real usable local map until the update right before Shattered Space. The story was there, but artifacts and Starborn feel secondary to the faction quest lines. Arguably, this does kind of fit in with the Unity and the concept of going back around again, but who wants to just continually do the same things over and over for eternity? The only variety outside of dialogue choices is in Constellation itself. Speaking of Shattered Space, the expansion and the update that preceded it did some things players were asking for. It was a bit short for a story expansion, but it came with a new handcrafted area to explore and some quality of life updates like true local maps. Prior to the release of Shattered Space, Bethesda added support for creations to Starfield. This was unsurprising as their two biggest titles, Skyrim and Fallout 4, had gotten support for mods on console many years before. Mods, however, were different from creations. Both of those titles had what Bethesda called Creation Club content. These pieces of essentially tiny DLC were made by Bethesda paid modders, and paid for by players via microtransactions. The two would eventually be combined into the same menu UI as simply creations, though now modders could upload their mods and set a price on them directly through Bethesda.net. Of course, Bethesda gets a cut of all those sales. Bethesda games are known as being some of the most moddable around, owing much of that to the creation engine. For a long time, mods were inaccessible to console players, so bringing that option to some of their games is genuinely very exciting, even if they don't all work properly. But the introduction of paid mods, especially as the only way to be able to keep earning trophies, from the company that brought you horse armor, smells like the same type of live service bullshit that Fallout 76 crawled out of to me. Terran Armada and the Free Lanes update just came out recently, and I started a new playthrough to see what it was all about. I greatly appreciate the changes made to crafting and some of the other new stuff that was added, but I don't think the game feels fundamentally any different. The DLC makes a point of highlighting the new features included with Free Lanes, which makes it feel very much like Fallout 4's Automatron. Unfortunately, that means it comes with the same annoying random encounters and somehow even less real story. It's not necessarily bad, just short and repetitive. A safe way to bring back some players and stack a few more dollars. Starfield does feel somewhat more interesting now, but it's still mostly a void. So, the answer to the question in the title of the video is basically, because they can. There are of course monetary reasons behind that, but it essentially keeps happening because it keeps working. But why does it work? Most games that have this problem aren't being released to the public in a pre-alpha state. They generally have a strong foundation of story, gameplay, or legacy at bare minimum. If we were to put that on a sliding scale, all of these titles started with at least a 50, but woes ensue. Some things take longer than expected, or sometimes, often, executives pile on pressure through deadlines. Saying nothing for the insane working conditions that game devs often deal with, this means some things are going to be forgotten. Some ideas are meant to evolve over time. They might start with a tech demo that gets integrated into a full game release, which is then intended to be built upon throughout the game's lifecycle. It could even be that the technology to do a thing doesn't exist yet, or isn't as efficient now as it will be later. And given how our society works, sometimes a studio does have to just get something out the door in order to make some money. In certain cases, like No Man's Sky, clearer communication could have solved much of the fanbase's frustration. But then the question becomes who will buy a game in Phase 1, and the money belt begins tightening again. When a game is inevitably released unfinished, what matters most is how the studio responds. Well, more accurately, the publisher. But the studio does all the work. Some games get shelved. Anthem is a great example of a game that was developed by an amazing studio and had so much potential, but was just killed by EA when it didn't meet expectations. Other companies take a different approach. Most of the examples discussed in this video prompted their respective studios to take a step back from new development and focus on fixing what they had just released. This could take the form of bug fixes, refining systems, or developing certain areas that had been neglected for whatever reason. Doing this begins to repair their community's trust and shapes the game into what it arguably should have been all along. Bringing these players back also generates more money from expansions. It's just good business. Strategy also often changes moving forward. The Pokémon company used to release mainline games more frequently, but now that they are larger, they're taking more time to refine them. Call of Duty did something very similar. Activision's famous cash cow still releases every year, but the workload has shifted significantly. They have added more studios to their roster and altered much of their development focus. Of course, each new Call of Duty still tends to have its problems, and they're now running on a mostly live service model. And that's the real problem, isn't it? Treating any art form or leisure activity like a service sucks all the fun and enjoyment out of it. Live service games are successful, sure, but their success is like that of a dealer retaining their clients. These games are often addictive and sold in pieces like they're the TikTok of gaming. Even free-to-play games profit by keeping you coming back, whether by you purchasing items from them or by showing you ads. Or data mining. That's always fun. Getting an unfinished game is frustrating regardless of the reason, but I think what's more important is how that situation is handled by the developer. When people are passionate about the thing they're making and the story they're telling, it shows. Not to say that someone can't be passionate about a live service game, but the idea is fundamentally different. Paintings are not sold via single strokes on a canvas. Video games are art as well. While pieces of art are arguably never finished, they reach a point where doing any more might spoil the masterpiece. I suppose I don't mind too much when games are released to the world a bit early as long as they reach that point, and preferably without having to pay for it twice. Let me know if you have any differing opinions or any suggestions of other topics I should cover. Just don't start a fight in my comments. Please like the video if you enjoyed and join the family if you want to see more nerdy shit like this. You can also find me across social media under the same name. Remember, love recklessly. Start with yourself.